August 29th, 1526. The wide sun-scorched plain near the town of Mohács lay silent in the morning haze, but silence would not last. On this flat ground, marshland broken by only a few gentle rises, the future of Central Europe trembled on the edge of a sword. To the south, beneath banners of green and crescent moons, stretched the vast host of the Ottoman Empire. At its head rode Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, 26 years old, armored in gilded steel, his face calm, but his gaze relentless. Behind him stood a war machine of staggering size, perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 soldiers, hardened by campaigns across 3 continents. Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Sultan, waited in disciplined rows, muskets gleaming. Sipahi cavalry wrapped in silks and mail sat astride restless horses. Siege artillery, massive bronze cannons loomed like dragons ready to breathe fire. Drums thundered their deep beat, carrying across the plain like the pulse of a coming storm. To the north, in hurried formations, stood the defenders of Hungary. Barely 25,000 men, Hungarian nobles, knights, German mercenaries, hastily raised infantry gathered around their youthful king, Louis II, not yet 21. His crown was barely settled on his head, yet fate demanded of him more than any ruler should endure. His army was a fragile mirror of the kingdom itself, proud but fractured, brave but unprepared. The plain of Mohács was no natural fortress. Open, flat, and exposed, it offered no walls to lean on, no hills to command. It was the wrong ground to make a stand, and yet here the Hungarians waited, hoping to halt the mightiest empire of the age. The stakes could not have been higher. Behind Louis lay Buda, the heart of Hungary, and beyond it, the Habsburg lands of Austria. If Hungary fell, the road to Vienna and the heart of Europe lay open. As the August sun climbed higher, the 2 armies faced one another. One, a disciplined empire at its zenith. The other, a kingdom on the edge of ruin, gambling everything on one desperate clash. What followed would not be a battle measured in days, but in minutes. And within 2 hours, Hungary's independence, built over centuries, would be swept away in blood and fire. To understand why the fields of Mohács became the graveyard of a kingdom, we must look back at the early 16th century. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was at the very peak of its power. Under the young but ambitious Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Europe. His armies had already conquered Belgrade in 1521, tearing open the southern frontier of Hungary, and in 1522 had expelled the Knights Hospitaller from Rhodes, securing dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. By 1526, Suleiman commanded not just an empire, but a machine of conquest that seemed unstoppable. Hungary, by contrast, was a kingdom in decline. Once a powerful realm under Matthias Corvinus, it had since fallen into division and decay. The crown passed to Louis II, a boy king crowned at the age of 10, who by his early 20s faced a crumbling state. Hungary's treasury was empty, drained by years of mismanagement and noble feuding. Its once proud army was outdated medieval knights, and feudal levies armed with spears and crossbows stood little chance against Ottoman muskets, cannons, and professional soldiers. Politically, Hungary stood isolated. The Habsburg dynasty to the west offered words of alliance, but little concrete help for Austria itself trembled before the Ottoman threat. To the north, the Polish crown was cautious, unwilling to be drawn into a war that could destroy it. And to the east, the rising power of the Ottoman-aligned Principality of Transylvania threatened to break away. Hungary stood alone, a fragile shield before the storm. Louis II himself was young and brave, but tragically inexperienced. He faced immense pressure from his nobles, many of whom demanded an immediate stand against the invader, more for their own honor than for strategy. They refused to fortify, refused to wait for reinforcements, and pushed their king toward a reckless decision. Meanwhile, Suleiman marched north with 60,000, 70,000 men, including the elite Janissaries Sipahi cavalry and a terrifying train of heavy artillery. He advanced methodically, securing bridges, feeding his men, and carrying with him the aura of an emperor destined to carve his name into history. Thus, by late August of 1526, the stage was set, a kingdom weakened by division, led by a boy king now standing alone against the greatest warlord of his age. And soon, on the fields of Mohács, these two worlds would collide in a clash that would shatter Hungary forever. By the summer of 1526, Hungary had little time left to prepare. Reports streamed into Buda. The Ottoman host had crossed the Sava River, their banners blotting out the horizon, their drums echoing like thunder over the Balkans. Suleiman advanced with methodical precision. Bridges erected roads, cleared supplies flowing like veins through the empire's body. He commanded an army that was not just vast, but frighteningly modern. Janissaries armed with matchlock muskets, Sipahi cavalry maneuvering like waves on horseback, artillery trains dragging cannons so massive they could shatter stone walls with a single shot. This was a machine of conquest, honed to perfection. In Hungary, the move was frantic. King Louis II, barely 21, scrambled to gather his forces. Messengers were dispatched to noble estates, calling every man to arms. What came was a patchwork army, perhaps 25,000 troops in all. Around 4,000 German mercenaries carried pikes and arquebuses, their discipline a faint glimmer of modern warfare. The rest were feudal levies, knights with medieval armor, and peasants carrying spears more suited to village defense than open battle. A handful of cannons, small, poorly cast, and without proper crews, were dragged onto the plain. Compared to the Ottoman arsenal, they were toys. Strategically, Louis faced a cruel dilemma. He could retreat behind the Danube, fortify Buda, and wait for reinforcements from Austria. But his nobles, obsessed with honor and fearful of losing their estates, demanded immediate confrontation. They argued that Hungary's only chance was to strike before the Ottomans reached deeper into the country. Under relentless pressure, the young king agreed. The choice of battlefield sealed their fate. The Hungarian army took position near Mohács, a flat, marshy plain with little natural defense. There were no rivers to guard their flanks, no hills to strengthen their artillery, no fortifications to slow the advance. It was the perfect ground for the Ottomans. As the last days of August approached, the contrast could not have been starker. Suleiman advanced with confidence, his armies stretched across the horizon like a living tide. Louis II stood with a smaller, weaker force bound by noble pride and fatal decisions. And as the drums of the Ottoman Empire grew louder, Hungary's destiny marched toward its reckoning. On the morning of August 29, 1526, the armies finally stood face to face. The wide, marshy plain near Mohács stretched between them, shrouded in a thin mist. To the south, the ground trembled under the advance of the Ottoman host, nearly 70,000 strong. Lines of Janissaries and gleaming armor formed a living wall. Sipahi cavalry fanned out like wings of steel, and behind them loomed a forest of artillery, the massive bronze cannons pointing north like open jaws. Their drums pounded relentlessly, echoing across the land like the heartbeat of an empire. To the north stood the Hungarian army, scarcely 25,000 men. They formed in hurried lines, knights on heavy horses, German mercenaries in tight pike formations, peasants clutching crude spears. A few small cannons sank into the mud, barely fit for battle. King Louis II, pale but resolute, rode among his men, urging courage with every gesture, though in his heart he must have felt the weight of doom. The Hungarians, pressed by their nobles, had chosen to strike quickly. Their plan was simple yet desperate: charge with their cavalry, break through the Ottoman center before Suleiman's artillery could unleash devastation and scatter the Janissary ranks. It was a gamble of speed over strength, a thrust of a dagger against an iron wall, Suleiman, calm and deliberate, had prepared the field with cunning precision. He arranged his forces in layered depth light troops to absorb the initial blow, Janissaries and artillery waiting behind, and cavalry ready to sweep in from the flanks. The ground itself was his ally. The flat marsh slowed heavy cavalry, while open fields gave full advantage to Ottoman firepower. As the sun rose higher, horns sounded across the plain. Ottoman skirmishers advanced, loosing arrows and musket fire, testing the Hungarian lines. The Hungarians replied with arquebus volleys, smoke drifting across the battlefield. For a moment, the plain was filled with the roar of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. But the true clash was yet to come. The Hungarian knights lowered their lances, preparing for the thunderous charge that might decide the fate of their kingdom. And as their horses pawed the ground, the mist lifted to reveal the waiting jaws of the Ottoman trap. The thunder of hooves had begun with hope, but within minutes, it dissolved into disaster. The Hungarian cavalry's desperate charge struck the Ottoman front, breaking through the first line of skirmishers. Knights in gleaming armor cut down archers and musketeers, their lances shattering shields, their swords spilling blood. For a brief heartbeat, it seemed possible the center of Suleiman's army wavered under the storm of steel. Shouts of triumph rang out as Hungarian banners surged forward. But Suleiman had designed this moment. The Ottoman front was never meant to hold, it was bait. As the Hungarians pushed deeper, they entered the killing ground. Suddenly, the Janissaries stepped forward, ranks of muskets raised in unison. Behind them, colossal cannons roared. Fire and iron tore through men and horses alike. Whole squadrons collapsed, their momentum shattered by thunderous volleys. What had begun as triumph turned instantly to carnage. The plain itself betrayed Hungary. The marshy soil slowed, horses' wheels of light artillery sank into mud, while Ottoman gunners on firm ground fired relentlessly. Clouds of smoke rolled across the battlefield, choking men, blinding formations. Cries of victory turned to screams of panic. The once proud cavalry, Hungary's last weapon, staggered and faltered in the mire. Then the trap closed. On both flanks, the Sipahi cavalry thundered forward, sweeping around like iron wings. Their lances struck the Hungarian sides, cutting down infantry and scattering mercenaries. The encirclement was swift, merciless, and absolute. By midday, the Hungarian army was surrounded. King Louis II, caught in the maelstrom, tried desperately to rally his men. His youthful face, pale beneath the crown, was streaked with dust and sweat as he raised his sword high. But around him, chaos reigned. Officers cut down banners, trampled formations collapsing. Peasants fled in terror. Mercenaries fell back under relentless fire, and knights found themselves drowning in mud and blood. For Hungary, this was the breaking point. Their gamble had failed. They had charged into a perfect snare, and now there was no escape. The battlefield of Mohács was no longer a contest. It had become a slaughterhouse. By midday, the battle was no longer a contest of arms, but a disaster unfolding in slow motion. The Hungarian charge, their one chance to break the Ottoman line, had been crushed. Now the field of Mohács became the stage for Suleiman's masterpiece of destruction. The Janissaries, disciplined and tireless, advanced like an iron wall. Their volleys of musket fire tore into what remained of Hungary's cavalry, each salvo punching holes through men and horses alike. Behind them, the great Ottoman cannons continued to roar, each blast collapsing entire clusters of desperate soldiers. The ground shook and smoke rolled like storm clouds, blotting out the sky. On the flanks, the Sipahi cavalry completed the encirclement. They crashed into Hungary's infantry from both sides, cutting down peasants and mercenaries without mercy. The rear collapsed, men drowning in marshes as they fled, others trampled by panicked horses. There was no retreat, no escape, only death or capture. This was the turning point. Hungary's army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Their formations dissolved, their banners fell, and their king was left stranded in the chaos. Louis II, only 21 years old, tried to rally what was left of his guard. He fought bravely, spurring his horse through the mud, waving his sword, as if sheer courage might hold back the tide. But courage was not enough. Around him, the royal standard fell, the last of his knights cut down one after another. The slaughter was total. In less than 2 hours, the flower of Hungary's nobility lay dead on the field. Bishops, barons, and magnates all were struck down alongside common soldiers. Estimates say over 14,000 Hungarians were killed, many drowning in the marshes or crushed under horses. The Ottoman losses, by contrast, were minimal, perhaps a few thousand at most. For Suleiman, the victory was absolute, but it was more than just a triumph of arms. It was the annihilation of a kingdom. Hungary, proud and defiant for centuries, had been broken in a single afternoon. The battle had reached its turning point, and for Hungary, there would be no recovery. From this day, their independence was doomed. The battlefield was already lost, but its most tragic moment was yet to come. Amid the choking smoke and thunder of Ottoman guns, King Louis II found himself alone. His royal guard was shattered, his banners fallen, his nobles slain. Barely 21 years old, he now rode through a nightmare of mud and corpses, his crown glinting faintly in the haze. The young king spurred his horse, desperate to escape the encirclement. To the north lay the marshes of the Seal stream, treacherous ground, but the only possible path to survival. With arrows falling around him and Ottoman cavalry closing in, Louis drove forward, mud splashing his horse, stumbling under the weight of armor. Behind him, what remained of his army was collapsing into silence. This was the climax of Mohács, the moment that sealed not only a battle, but a kingdom's fate. As Louis reached the swampy bank, his horse lost footing. Exhausted and panicked, it reared, then collapsed backward into the mire. The king, trapped under his armored mount, was dragged beneath the black water. There, the last hope of Hungary drowned unseen in the chaos of battle. Elsewhere across the field, the slaughter continued with merciless precision. Over 14,000 Hungarians had already perished. The Ottoman ring tightened, cutting down any who still resisted. The flower of Hungary's aristocracy was extinguished. 7 bishops, 28 barons, 200 nobles, all dead in a single day. For the Ottoman soldiers, it was a victory beyond imagining. For Hungary, it was annihilation. Suleiman, seated beneath the imperial pavilion, watched with calm detachment as his enemies were destroyed. To him, this was not merely triumph, it was destiny fulfilled. The Christian bulwark of Central Europe had been shattered in one afternoon, and the road to Buda, the Hungarian capital, now lay open. The field of Mohács became a graveyard. Corpses covered the plain banners, trampled into the mudblood mixing with stagnant water. Survivors staggered into the marshes only to drown or be hunted down. In less than 2 hours, the kingdom of Hungary, once proud, once defiant, was reduced to silence. The climax of Mohács was not a single clash of arms, but the drowning of a king, the death of a nation, and the dawn of Ottoman supremacy in Central Europe. As the sun dipped low over the plain of Mohács, silence settled where thunder had raged only hours before. The battlefield was transformed into a graveyard. More than 14,000 Hungarians lay dead among them, bishops, barons, and nobles who had formed the heart of the kingdom's leadership. The young king Louis II, drowned in the Tsale Marsh, was never recovered by his men. His death marked not only the loss of a monarch, but the collapse of an entire realm. The Ottoman dead were few in comparison, perhaps $500 to $2,000 at most. For Suleiman the Magnificent, the victory was overwhelming. He had shattered Hungary's army in less than 2 hours, destroyed its leadership, and left the road to the capital Buda open. Within weeks, the Ottomans would march into the city unopposed, claiming vast swaths of Central Europe for their empire. The consequences were catastrophic for Hungary. Without a king, without an army, the kingdom was torn apart. The Central Plains fell under Ottoman occupation. The West was absorbed by the Habsburgs. Transylvania became a semi-independent vassal. What had once been a powerful European kingdom was reduced to fragments, its sovereignty broken. The loss at Mohács marked the beginning of 150 years of Ottoman dominance in Hungary. Yet the legacy of Mohács went beyond borders. Across Europe, the shock was profound. The fall of Hungary left Central Europe exposed. Vienna itself would soon face siege, only narrowly resisting the Ottoman advance. For the Christian powers, Mohács became a warning written in blood, a reminder of what happened when unity failed and when courage was crushed by strategy and firepower. For the Ottomans, the battle became one of their greatest triumphs, remembered as a symbol of imperial destiny. For Hungary, it was remembered as the nation's graveyard. Generations of Hungarians would look back on Mohács not simply as a lost battle, but as the moment their independence was shattered, their nobility extinguished, and their land divided among greater powers. On that August day in 1526, the fate of Hungary was sealed in mud and blood. The Battle of Mohács was not just the end of an army or of a king, it was the end of an era. This was more than a battle. Mohács was a turning point that reshaped the map of Europe for centuries to come.